Good morning. Not a lot terribly good about it, but here we all are. I have a cracking headache. I've eaten something that doesn't agree with me. I was up until after 3 a.m. faffing around. So, in other words, perfect for doing this show. You know the shtick by now. I'm just reacting to stuff in a completely uninformed and off-the-cuff manner from the news for the day. So, yeah. Oh, and there's always something shit. But I'm in the perfect mood for a Monday morning. Housekeeping, then. While I wait for a few people to trickle in. I missed my mini convention I normally go to every year, which was shit. But Cat needs looking after, my mum needs looking after. I still managed to get 2 online games in this weekend. A very short game of Chalt with a woefully underprepared Ventures to Tennis, which you can see over on the Inappropriate Characters channel. I'm looking into turning some of the stuff we do over there into podcasts. Anchor FM looks like a reasonable route to do that, and for doing some of my own stuff. So yeah, keep a lookout for that. Don't know when I'm going to get around to it. There's YouTube changes are coming, which I will rant about at the end, I think, when I'm also addressing people's comments and so on from the chat. So that can wait till then. Still don't expect any huge number of videos lately, though I am starting to feel it. but I'll get to that at the end. Once I've gone through the news and once I've addressed any comments or whatever else. Anyway, I hope you all have a better start to your week than I'm having. And let's jump right into it. British Steel has been in trouble for a while now, and well, it looks like it's going to be rescued. by a Chinese firm, which basically means the Chinese government, in a £70 million deal. Here's the problem with that, right? You can sell off a lot of your steel industry and it can be fine, right? A lot of it in this day and age isn't necessarily commercially viable on an international basis. But you need steel, and you need steel you can rely on, and you need steel for defense contracts, things like that, internally, which is why retaining some sort of nationalized steel production is a good idea, and why farming it out to the Chinese isn't a particularly good idea. So while I welcome the fact that some workers are going to keep their jobs and all the rest of it, and steel production will continue, I do have concerns about handing over important internal steel production and turning British Steel into the People's Republic of Sheffield. Yeah, it's a tad concerning, and even with the Chinese bailout, whatever, there still needs to be a lot of investment in what's left of British Steel. So yeah, they are talking about raising the production. The thing about China is there's really no meaningful difference between Chinese companies and the Chinese state. They're intertwined, right? They call themselves communist, they call themselves socialist, but really China's corporatist, and that's what less ostensibly left-wing totalitarian regimes have tended to be in the past, like the naughty no word Germans from the interwar period. Yeah, when you bring a company into the governmental fold, when it's hard to delineate the difference between the two, that's not socialism, that's not communism, that's corporatism. And that seems to be where Chinese pseudo-capitalism has gone, and it's a big part of why they can undercut and cause havoc for other people's industries. Yeah, they were liberalising, but things have gone a bit pear-shaped. But anyway, good thing, people are saving their jobs and so on. Bad thing, you need secure steel production in country for projects like, shipbuilding. Yeah, so we'll see how this all pans out, I'm sure. The NHS has finally approved 2 drugs derived from cannabis. Now, there's been a lot of fusses about this lately, as parents with sick kids have been semi-legally or illegally accessing things like CBD oil and so on. It's not all of it's been legalized. You can get some of it. And a lot of people with other issues like MS, I'm trying to remember, but it's a lot of basic pain management, nausea management, nerve disorders, things like that respond quite well to cannabis or cannabis-derived treatments. So a lot of people have been breaking the law in order to treat their own illnesses with cannabis, which they find better than a lot of other options. Finally, 2 have been approved. These are used to treat epilepsy and multiple sclerosis. So good news if you have either of those. It doesn't work for everybody. It's not a panacea. It's not some kind of magical cure-all for anything. But it's another option. And it does tend to work quite well and not have the same kind of side effects that a lot of drugs normally developed for treating these issues has. So yeah, that's good. And this is in particular, the epilepsy drug is used on children in particular. So yeah, they're not going to get stoned. It's extracting, like as medical science does, the necessary active compounds. So it's not going to make them high or anything, but it should help. So yeah, good news there. The law was originally changed in November of 2018. So it's been about a year since specialist doctors have been allowed to prescribe cannabis medicines, but it's taken this long for cannabis-derived drugs to be approved. So I'm sure that story interests you, Sonic, who I see has come into the chat. Comments and questions will be dealt with at the end. Your call is important to us. But there's more in the pipeline, but with the Conservatives in power for now, at least, and possibly into the future, it's hard to tell how much more liberalisation will occur around cannabis. But we'll see, I guess. The election is obviously dominating the news over here. Jo Swinson's been doing the rounds, apparently cosplaying as Velma in her orange sweater, which makes my libido rather confused. Who doesn't like Velma? But they've had a good idea, which is to grant, basically, everyone will have access to a £10,000 grant for adults to do adult education, retraining, and so on. So our economy, our situation, our industry changes really rapidly, and a lot of the reason for a lot of problems that we have in former coal mining towns or northern industrial towns and so on is that the industries that traditionally held up those communities became obsolete or impolitic or environmentally unsound or superseded or whatever else, and then there was basically no way for the people there to retrain and do anything else. Kids' education changed, but it took a generation or two for things to really change in those communities, and then they all went into services, which if we Brexit are going to be hit the hardest. Yay! So it's a double whammy for northern communities that have adapted. And it is a problem for adults to get access to further education and so on. So granting £10,000, and it is a grant, is a really good way to go, I think. And that's specifically in order to retrain people in new skills, to get new qualifications and so on, to basically return them to the employable pool. So it's good, and they seem to have been kind of dragging the main parties with them a bit, because both Labour and the Conservatives are going to announce other policies around lifelong training and so on in the coming weeks. Labour's proposed a national education service, so it's kind of like a community college, but more so, and that would be free, just like basic and secondary education is. The Conservatives are on about a national retraining scheme, but the details on that are sketchier than Boris Johnson's funding for the election. But they all seem to be on the same page. They all seem to be competing on the same thing. It's just a matter of extent and approach and of what has been presented. I think the Lib Dems plan is probably the best. But if you're going to grant £10,000 to every adult in order to retrain, why not just cut out the middleman, cut out the time and the problem and the distance, and just knock £10,000 off every student debt, or give a £10,000 grant to every student so that they can train then, rather than entering the workforce with a huge amount of crippling debt, because then they might be able to afford further training later on because it take them less time to pay off that debt. And this is the kind of social investment that makes a really big difference in terms of countries' economies, skill bases, skill sets. Makes a big difference to the individual. It pays for itself pretty rapidly in most cases. So to me, why do this later? Why not just front load it, or make it a lifelong amount of money so that you can use it to pay towards a university education? I don't know. It all seems like nibbling at the edges while the cake is on fire, so to speak. Hong Kong. Oh, this will get me demonetized. There's been another shooting. I would say there's remarkable restraint on the part of China, but not compared to other nations, but just compared to the way they've acted about these things. in the past. But this policeman shot a protester, and this was being live streamed on Facebook at the time. I haven't watched it, I just can't. I find that kind of thing upsetting. The officer pulled his gun, he's barely 2 feet away from him, and shot him point blank range in the chest. First once, then they grappled, and there were another 2 shots. It's a freaking mess, and every death is just gonna incite more reaction, counter-reaction. It's been fascinating watching a lot of these protests around the world and how they've adapted to things like facial recognition with masks and lasers and makeup and umbrellas to rebound tear gas canisters, traffic cones and water to disable tear gas canisters. In South America, we've seen improvised mortars used to fire at police. And if you want to go way back, the Ukraine riots saw people fighting in formation like a Greek phalanx and all kinds of other stuff. I had kind of thought protest was dead, really, because governments have adapted to it. They just ignore it. We've got kettling in this country and so on. But if it comes to the point of rioting and violence and widespread civil unrest, it seems that the protesters, again, are getting the upper hand, at least in that side of things. But marching and asking nicely doesn't seem to accomplish anything anymore, anywhere. Which is unfortunate, because that's more likely to drive people to violence. There you go. Let's see if this sidebar story is actually interesting. Oh, for the election. This wasn't one I was planning to cover, but it just looks interesting. There's been a survey done by a couple of news organisations. The BBC one is the one I'm looking at, to find out what people actually do, because there's a lot of talk about the working class and the other classes and what we actually do in this country. Let's see. Most of it is services. And as I said earlier, as I intimated earlier, services are the thing that's going to be hit hardest by Brexit. 25, 47, 67, 68, 78. 84% of British workers work in services. 8% in manufacturing. 7% in construction. And only 2% in agriculture and energy. So when people start talking about fishing, or quotas for food production, the common agricultural policy and so on, consider that only 2% of the workforce works in those areas. And fishing, for example, is, I think it's less than 1% of the UK economy. May even be 0.1%. What percentage of the UK economy is fishing? Oh, no, I was wildly overestimating how much of the economy is fishing. So this is in terms of economic activity, right? Not the number of people employed. It's the number of people employed in fishing is within that 2% agriculture and energy. Why they combine those two, I don't know. But fishing only accounts for 0.1% of the UK economy, as opposed to that overwhelmingly large percentage involved in services. So where do you think we should apply our most concern? Fishing or service industry? Which one's going to have the biggest hit on our economy? Crippling, damaging, and making less competitive are 0.1% of the economy that's fishing, or crippling and undermining and making less competitive the over 80% of our economy that's services, right? That's public services like health and education. That's financial and business services, which is the next biggest chunk. That's retail, hotels and restaurants, which are likely to be affected heavily, transport and communications, and generic other services. So it's both public and private service sector. 80% of the economy or 0.1% of the economy. Do the math, or maths, depending which side of the Atlantic you're on. Speaking of elections, been an election in Spain. The governing Socialist Party, PSOE, whatever that stands for, they got the most seats but didn't get a majority. So they're now a minority government. They're going to have to form a coalition with somebody. European politics is more used to having to do that than we are. More used to compromise, making deals. I kind of wish we'd switch over to proportional representation, so that would be the case here. But right-wing parties gained a lot of ground. The Conservative Popular Party came in second, and the far-right Vox Party more than doubled its seats to become the country's third most powerful party. So that's concerning. Spain and Portugal and Greece and to a lesser extent Italy have all had issues with the populist right. It's not just a British problem. It's not just an American problem. It's everywhere to one extent or another. And we seem to have forgotten how to argue the case against this kind of populist nationalist right, which I lament, and I try to do in my own small little way, though it seems to alienate people who watch me for other stuff. But tough. I'm not here to tell you what you need to hear. I'm not here to tell you what you want to hear. I'm here to tell you what you need to hear, what I think you need to hear. We need to burst those echo chamber bubbles more and more. But yeah, it's not discouraging because the left has held their ground there, but it is discouraging in that the right has surged. And that's generally speaking not a good idea given Spanish history, like Franco and the Spanish Civil War. Sticking with politics, in Bolivia, President Morales has resigned amidst mass protests. That's where those mortars were being used that I mentioned. Now, it seems like a popular uprising, but what seems to have forced his hand is the army telling him to go. So whether we're seeing a popular coup or a military coup isn't exactly clear. But then most revolutions, most revolts depend on turning the army, and this has been the case since the fall of the Soviet Union and its satellite states. So when Americans go on and on about how they need to have personal firearms in order to protect against overarching government, well, I now have two examples I can point to. George W. Bush massively took away American freedoms and privacy, and Trump has been a colossal fuck-up. And has anyone used their firearms to rise up against George W. Bush or Trump? No. No, they haven't. Quite the opposite. They've taken up arms to attack the minorities and groups, whether you agree with them or not, doesn't really matter, that are being more victimized by American right-wing governments. So, yeah, shut the fuck up. So this uprising kind of went off after electoral shenanigans. So maybe there's hope that people will wake up to the electoral shenanigans that have been going on over here, but I don't think the Brits quite have the temperament to do a massive popular uprising against the government. We'll just give them a hard Paddington Bear stare and tut a lot. Hasn't really worked in the past, but at least it's less violent, I suppose. So yeah, keep an eye on Bolivia. Between Venezuela, Bolivia, issues in Brazil and other places, South America is looking like the next kind of powder keg, really. So worth keeping an eye on. Weather, or rather climate, and there is an important difference here. I find myself picking up on these stories more, which is probably a cognitive bias I should keep an eye on. But the science seems to suggest that weather is becoming more extreme, or at least more extreme weather is becoming more common, and that does fit the idea of global warming and climate change. Because the more heat, the more energy you have in the system, the more chaotic and powerful it becomes. And yes, that can mean blizzards as well as droughts and flooding. But a cyclone, I don't know how you pronounce this, I think Bulbul, perhaps, has torn through coastal areas of Bangladesh and India, killing 13 people. Okay, that's not that many. But it has displaced 2 million people. So think about those kind of numbers. Think about climate refugees. We've already lost a lot of islands, Pacific Island communities, Caribbean island communities, as water's rising just a very small amount. It's enough to make a lot of those places uninhabitable. It's an unspoken environmental genocide, which is kind of leading to a Polynesian diaspora, which is great inspiration for fiction, but not great for the people being displaced. But Bangladesh is an interesting one because it has always suffered from flooding and storms and other climate-related issues, but it's happening over and over again. It's not a very rich nation, and lots of people are being killed and displaced, and it's probably an early indicator of somewhere that's going to be rendered fairly non-viable for human habitation in relatively short order, maybe within our lifetimes, at least in any kind of modern, stable sense. So that may be one of the first places we see direct climate refugees. Syria's civil war and issues and Venezuela's problems are in part climate related, but there's big political factors as well. Bangladesh may be the first really big, genuine climate refugee thing that happens. It may be one of the first noteworthy populist nations to be really hit by this. So don't let people bullshit you and try to deny that there are issues. There are. It's just not affecting us so much in the Northern Hemisphere yet. But I have another story on that that's frankly utterly fucking terrifying, as most of this stuff is. Again, I strongly suggest reading The Uninhabitable Earth by David Wallace Wells. And there's another book I read recently about how to rebuild a civilization from scratch. I don't think I've got that handy. But, you know, that should be in every prepper's library, I guess. If I'm getting scared, and I'm pretty level-headed, then I think we probably all should get a bit more scared. Sticking with climate issues, another example, Australian bushfires are now a state of emergency, and it's a catastrophic threat. Thousands of people in Australia, which is a modern westernised nation, have been displaced. Thankfully, just thousands. But these fires are sweeping in on the more heavily populated areas of Australia. I don't know how familiar you are with Australia, but Yanks out there or whoever else. But its population is really, really clustered in a very few areas, a very few big sort of conurbations. And then there's like steel towns, mining towns, and so on dotted around throughout the outback. But it's very sparsely populated outside of those well-populated coastal areas. So when something like this happens, and close to one of their urban areas, it's a bigger deal than it might be in some other more equitably populated, more heavily developed nations. Not that I'm saying Australia's underdeveloped, you know what I mean. Now, these fires and things, they're natural, and to an extent we've made problems for ourselves in extinguishing smaller brush fires and bushfires in the past. This is a problem that consistently hits America as well. We prevent these fires from going, and so the tinder, in effect, builds up, and so when it does go off, it's bigger. But it's still to do with climate. It's a huge issue. Satellite images just demonstrate how much of a monstrous fire it is, and the skies have literally turned orange in huge swathes of areas because of the smoke and the dust and the ash. People's lives are being ruined, and again, this thing is going to be more powerful and more common heading into the future, and a lot faster than many of us thought, because a lot of the climate models have been quite wrong, but not in the way that climate skeptics want it to be. Things are worse than we anticipated. Things are moving faster than we anticipated. And I think a big part of that, because there's been a lot of discussion about that, and it's actually been used as a reason to ignore the climate studies and so on, which is crazy. But the thing is, our science is so specialized in very small areas a lot that it's hard for people to kind of step back and take into account the bigger, broader picture and how these things interact. And it's only relatively recently we've started thinking about cascade effects and knock-on effects and so on. And I think that's a big part of why it's worse. For example, as the global temperature rises, you get longer and further north thaws in the north. That melts the permafrost and expels huge amounts of methane and CO2 from ancient vegetation and so on that was previously sealed up under the permafrost. And we're also going to see increased expellation of methane hydrates. Now that's basically solid dry ice like methane, very simply. Go and look it up, I can't do it justice. That's held under pressure and under low temperature in swamps and frozen swamps, Finland, frozen lakes, and under the sea. And as the temperature rises, that gets released, and that has a knock-on effect. And methane is a worse greenhouse gas than CO2. So it's these knock-on effects that make things unpredictable and seem to have made things worse than they would otherwise be. Moving on. This is kind of interesting and also grotesque. A Russian professor who is a bit of a colourful character and is obsessed with Napoleon, dresses up as Napoleon, doesn't think he's Napoleon, but he's referred to his lovers as Josephine and insists that people call him sire and so on. Quite well known in Russia, apparently. This is Oleg Sokolov. He was discovered drunk in a river with a woman's severed limbs in a backpack. Now, this was his lover, who apparently he had shot following a dispute, former student of his. He's 63, by the way. I don't necessarily have a problem with age gaps, but yeah, bit dodgy. So apparently they had an argument. He shot her. He cut her arms and legs and head off and tried to get rid of them, planning to kill himself publicly later while dressed as Napoleon, but fell in, got discovered, got arrested. If you're planning to just kill yourself, why dismember your partner? That suggests that you're seeking to get away with it, but it's reported that he was planning to kill himself. So why try and hide it? Something doesn't really gel here. But he's probably just lying or out of his mind at this point. You'd kind of have to be. It's a horrendous crime. But like a lot of Russian interference lately, he's also associated with the right and the far right. This time in France, which makes sense given that he's glorifying Napoleon. But he was heavily involved in France's Institute of Social Science, Economics and Politics, ISEP, which was founded by Marion Maréchal, a niece of the National Rally Party leader Marine Le Pen, and former policymaker for the Front National, this being French. So there's a lot to dig into there, and it probably won't get a lot of play over here. But interesting, grotesque, and something just doesn't sit right in a lot of ways, and not just him dressing as Napoleon. Right, it was Armistice Day. Yep, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, and all that. Poppy Day. I wear white poppies rather than red ones, but the white ones are made to an even lower standard than the red ones, and my last one fell apart, so I'll have to reorder some for next year. I choose the white poppy, the peace poppy, because to me that's what remembrance should have always been about: avoiding war, preserving peace, acknowledging the monstrous number of people killed in the two world wars, and not just them, but others. But increasingly here in the UK, the Poppy Day has been hijacked by a kind of jingoistic, right-wing, rah-rah, worship the troops like the Americans do sort of thing, which I've found increasingly distasteful, to the point where I no longer donate to the Poppy Appeal and so on. I do things directly instead for wounded soldiers, things like that. Even that's being hijacked by people like Britain First and so on. It's a dodgy area. But I get the white poppy specifically because of all this. And elections don't normally play out much to do with defence, outside of arguing over spending, Trident, nuclear missiles, that sort of thing. But I think because this election has fallen in the winter and spans Armistice Day, the Conservatives and Labour in particular are arguing, so it's another election story, arguing over ways that they can improve the lives and so on of service personnel and their families here in the UK. So it's not hugely clear, but they seem to be promising additional childcare for military families. That's a huge cost for any family, right? And to provide veterans with a rail card, so they'll get either discounted or free travel. That's the Tory ideas. They also want to change the law to protect veterans from vexatious legal action. So we've had a few cases where British troops involved in dodgy shenanigans, maybe just slightly north of war crimes, and murders, in essence, have been pursued in the courts. And some of these rulings have gone against them. The Tories want to protect them from that, which to me seems like it's kind of giving people free license to engage in semi-legal behaviours in war and to straight up murder people. It doesn't seem like a vote winner to me. I mean, we want our troops to behave honourably, right? Surely. And we want them to keep to the Geneva Conventions and all the other things that we've signed up to. Yeah, we want to fight cleanly, even against enemies who don't do that. You know, it's important to maintain the moral high ground for a whole lot of reasons. So I would worry that the Tories are eroding that in their kind of gung-ho, jingoistic, rah-rah-rah, huzzah for the military sort of side. Labour's promised improved support for children in armed forces families and better wages, which seems like a better set of policies to me. Soldiers do get massively underpaid, but they have better access to free housing and so on. The military here isn't a substitute for the welfare system like it is in the US, but it is an escape route out of poverty and those aforementioned former industrial towns for a lot of people. Personally, I find that exploitative. You know, you find people who don't have any hope, don't otherwise have access to education or whatever, and you force them into the military to fill out your numbers and send them to fight and die on the off chance that they'll get decent enough training to get a better future and won't just be crippled and maimed by it. But there you go. There was a lot of fuss that Corbyn didn't go to some special separate thing other than the meetup at the Cenotaph that goes off every year, but he wasn't invited, so it's a bit peculiar for the Sun and the Express in particular to go after Corbyn, saying, oh, he don't care about our troops, fuck him. It's a bit odd to go after him for that when he wasn't invited, and I don't think it's the kind of thing that he would have gone to anyway, because it seemed a bit like the kind of jingoistic rah-rah-rah thing that I'm also against. But he did go to the cenotaph and lay a wreath. The more I've discovered about my grandfather and my great-uncle's service in World War II, the more I'm convinced that they would have been vocally pro-EU, because they would have been vocally, pro-peace, and that they too would be horrified by the way in which the Poppy Appeal and the Armistice Day remembrance and everything has been hijacked by the far right. People who fought fascism aren't going to be too impressed by the far right, whatever country they happen to be from. And my grandfather, as I've mentioned many times before, was amongst the soldiers that liberated Belsen. And those kind of horrors, I would imagine, stay with you. This is a story that probably should have been around before the general election was called, but leaders of all the main parties seem to be worried that trust in the political system is at stake. And it absolutely is. People have no real faith in their politicians anymore. It's not entirely the politicians' fault. I think most people don't understand how UK politics is supposed to work, what the role of an MP is, whether they're supposed to just do what the electorate says, or whether they're supposed to have minds of their own, how the checks and balances work in our system. Our constitution is unwritten, so even fine legal minds have little idea of how it all works. And the whole Brexit thing and elections since Cameron's first one have basically shown all the fractures and problems in our political system. But there still doesn't seem to be any particular appetite to change that from the two main parties, and until one of them flips, and one would have hoped it would have been the Labour Party, but unfortunately it's not, we're not going to see the kinds of root and branch reform that we need that might restore trust. Let's take Brexit. Please take Brexit as an example of why trust in politicians is fucked at the moment. Broadly speaking, you've got two camps, and these have just hardened and shifted a bit over time, but you've got two camps: Leave and Remain. The Leave people have lost trust in politics because, to their mind, the referendum has been ignored, eroded, is at threat of being overturned. What about the 17 million? All of that shit, right? And it's the optics that make it understandable why people feel that democracy is being undermined, and so on. But a lot of that is to do with the aforementioned problems with not understanding how a democracy works, what a representative democracy is, as opposed to a direct democracy, all the rest. I could go on for hours. On the other side, you have the Remain camp, whose faith in democracy has been damaged because the vote went the wrong way. For a number of reasons that erode our democracy. We've got our MPs, who are meant to be representatives who do what's best, not necessarily what we tell them to do, forcing through the worst versions of a Brexit on the basis of a tiny majority that wouldn't be enough in practically any other nation to make such a big constitutional change. 2/3 is basically what you're looking for. The referendum campaign itself was corrupt, illegal, and if it had been a binding referendum, would have been overturned by the High Court. You can go and read the papers yourself and see interviews with the lawyers and so on involved. So from a Remainer point of view, we have a reckless runaway government that is forcing something that should never have been passed, a result that should have been overturned because of the illegality and everything. And now, furthermore, we have the current incumbent government covering up reports into Russian interference and involvement. I know Americans are going to groan at that, but there does seem to be more evidence of Russian involvement and collusion in UK politics even than there is in US politics. And, they've straight up assassinated people on British soil. which kind of suggests that they are interested and involved in our politics and what goes on in our country. So you got both sides, which have become increasingly polarized, and both think that there are deep problems with democracy. And you also have to remember that only about 60% of the eligible voting population voted in the referendum, and that was a record turnout and an amazing thing and to be celebrated. But that leaves the 30% of people who are still utterly unengaged with our politics, many of whom are, like me, completely disenfranchised from our political process because of the way first past the post works. There are no parties that appeal to them. Yeah, all kinds of other issues. They don't feel that their vote's ever going to make a difference, and that can be justified. I still vote. I did spoil my ballot once, but I still vote, even though it's never going to mean anything here. But I understand where those disengaged people are coming from. So, one lot of people thinks democracy is being wrecked for one reason. Another lot of people think our democracy is being wrecked for another reason. And another lot of people just don't think our democracy should be called a democracy, even, because they feel no investment. And that's why nobody cares. And the people we have leading our country are not the best. Look at Bojo. Look at Corbyn. Look at Joe Swinson's naked opportunism. This is a political class. These aren't people who know how the sausage is made. They're not people who know economics. Not that anybody really knows economics. It's voodoo. These are not people who run hospitals. These are not people who've served in the military or worked in education or any of the big issues. They're a political class who exist to be elected. And if they've got an ideology, even, you're lucky. Boris doesn't have an ideology other than make Boris great again. Corbyn has an ideology, but he's been kind of hijacked by other ideologies. Swinson is just an opportunist. It's all fucked. I covered the Russia report when I was ranting there, so that can go. Apple's being investigated by a US financial regulator because the Apple credit card apparently has different credit limits for men and women, which is being decried as sexist. Here's the problem, right? And I think this is an issue we're going to increasingly see. The credit limits are produced essentially without human interaction. Like so many other things these days, the credit limits are set by an algorithm. And the algorithm doesn't necessarily know or care what gender you are. It cares about your spending habits and your income and all of these kind of things. And then it spits out a credit limit after churning through all that data. And yet there is this perceived sexist difference between the credit limits for men and the credit limits for women. And this appears to be because on aggregate there are different spending and saving and paying off behaviours. So it's not sexism necessarily. I mean, we don't have access to the algorithm to be absolutely sure. It seems unlikely to be sexism. It seems to be the unintentional result of an attempt to make an objective process for determining credit limits. But if it comes down to aggregate behaviour, I mean, what can you really do? Somehow it's making this division. If you do away with that division, it's not going to be in favour of women, it's going to be to the detriment of men, because they'll need to soak up that risk somewhere else. It's like with car insurance, right? For a while, there were a whole bunch of car insurers that would only insure women, or had special, much lower premiums for women. Why? Well, there's a bunch of reasons, but the long and the short of it is that men tend to get into more accidents and engage in more risky behaviour. It's not just that. Men tend to do more driving, and more high-speed driving over longer distances. So, but I don't want to get bogged down in the details. So women, because on aggregate they're safer drivers, could have lower premiums. That was struck down as sexist, I believe, by the European Court of Human Rights, actually, in a rare win for for male equality there. But do you think that the men started getting a better deal, or do you think that the women started getting a worse deal because they had to even out the risk somewhere? And of course the companies will have made more profit out of the opportunity to shift those results. I think we got the same kind of thing here. I mean, facts are facts. I accept and understand that as a guy who drives, I'm considered a higher risk, even though I'm a very careful and timid driver. It's just, you can't really argue with facts, and this seems like a similar instance. So is it sexism or is it differences in behaviour? One to watch. China has this big oppressive surveillance state going on, and in particular that's its social credit system and the way in which it monitors or blocks off all manner of internet behaviour. This may not be entirely bad. It's 99.9999 recurring percent bad, but that tiny remainder may actually be something good. Because they're using it to prevent suicides in China. So there are programs, algorithms again, which detect dangerous suicidal behavior messages and so on, trends and so on, and they flag them up to volunteers, and those volunteers can then use that information to mount a rescue mission, for want of a better term. But this all relies on massive surveillance. So is it good that people are being prevented from killing themselves? Yeah. There's going to be false positives and a lot of awkwardness and confusion. And is it a violation of privacy? That one's more tricky because these are public or semi-public messages that are being scanned. So people are doing something in public. But then is it an invasion of privacy to intervene? And do you have the right to take your own life? It's complicated. I'm just trying to take it as some tiny spark of light in the dystopian social credit system that's coming for us all, and the social media monitoring that's already here, in that at least some tiny fraction of it might be used for good to prevent people doing themselves in. Back to climate change and that terrifying thing I was talking about. As sea ice is melting, as permafrost is melting, it's not just methane and CO2 that's being belched out into the atmosphere at an ever-increasing rate, but organisms, particularly microorganisms that have been frozen in this ice for thousands, even tens of thousands of years, are being released. This has been a concern for some time in the medical community, figuring that we may well have a new pandemic or some kind of entirely novel disease spring up as climate change continues. This is mostly theoretical. An insane Russian scientist extracted one particular microorganism from melting permafrost and insanely injected himself with it. If there was ever going to be a zombie apocalypse, that was the time. Fortunately, he didn't get ill and didn't start biting people or anything. But it just goes to show that there are people stupid enough to trigger a pandemic by thinking that injecting themselves with ancient, prehistoric viruses seems like a good idea. I mean, we would hope that human populations from the past would have immunity and that would be passed on to some of us, but still. But now we have an example of a new pathogen being released and genuinely infecting and ravaging populations in the real world. So there's a virus that affects marine mammals, so things like sea otters, seals, that kind of thing. This isn't a new disease, but the loss of sea ice and the warmer seas and so on have helped with the spread of, what's it called? Phocine distemper virus, PDV. And it's now spread from animals in the North Atlantic to populations in the North Pacific due to the loss of sea ice and the increase of temperature. This is an existing virus, but it does demonstrate the problem. I think, and it's really only a matter of time. So invest more in the CDC and other disease research, because sooner or later it's going to come for us. And mammals are close enough that diseases can pass from other mammals to us. So be concerned. Speaking of climate change, they're on about bringing in speed limits for ships. This is apparently of massive benefit. A 20% reduction in ship speed could cut greenhouse gases, but also curb pollutants that damage human health, such as black carbon and nitrogen oxides that come from burning diesel and oil and so on, and would cut underwater noise pollution by up to 2/3, helping whales and so on. Of course, it might mean an extra day before your cheap plastic tack gets here from China, but, you know, it's one of those relatively simple solutions we could do. More election stuff, more Brexit stuff. Something like 10% of the NHS. I did have the stats the other day, God. But a lot of people that work in the NHS come from the EU. And a lot of them are leaving, and a lot of people aren't coming over since the referendum result, leaving us with a shortfall. A shortfall that we can't really make up with from training, in part because we've taken away nurses' bursaries. And we've been trying to encourage people from outside the EU to come over and take these jobs. And that's been difficult as well. The Conservatives want to bring in an NHS visa so that if you're a medical worker from the rest of the world outside Europe, it should, in theory, become easier for you to immigrate into the UK. But it's kind of rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. And it's also being kept kind of semi-low-key because, well, a lot of the people that back Brexit, not all by any means, but a lot of the people that back Brexit did it because of xenophobia and racism. And if they learn that the loss of EU immigration to fill holes in our medical system is going to be replaced by people from Islamic nations, brown people, shall we say, they're not going to be best pleased. Which is why I think this isn't getting as much play as it probably should. Labour haven't particularly spelled out a huge policy here, but they have attacked the Conservatives about it. They're talking more in general terms about their immigration policy and in general terms about investing in the NHS. We'll see how this all plays out. Frankly, I think we're going to end up with another hung parliament and nobody's really going to be able to accomplish much of anything, but there you go. We talked about childcare support. Last thing to cover then, before I'll talk about YouTube and field any questions or comments. So put them in now. So Roy Chubby Brown is an unfunny, quite racist, un-PC comedian. I don't rate him very much. If you like him, that's fine. If other people like him, that's fine. But yeah, he's controversial. He is racist. His jokes are racist. There's no getting around it. In one of his recent shows, I believe, he came on stage to Gangnam Style. And then as a joke, he called out to turn off that slitty-eyed shit. Yep, that's his humour, I guess. I'm all for transgression, but for me at least, it's not something I would watch or listen to or want. But if other people do, fill your boots. But he was banned from having a show in Middlesbrough. That ban was then reversed, and then the head of Middlesbrough Town Hall resigned at the ban being reversed. So nobody is particularly a winner here, I guess. And at least the person there had the principles to resign their position over not getting their way. Which is something. I mean, people like Roy Chubby Brown are dinosaurs. I think progress will see them gone regardless. It's just a matter of time. You really just have to wait for things like that to change, hard as it might be. Like I say, I find him desperately unfunny. a holdover from the days of Bernard Manning and the likes, but if you find him funny, yeah, you go ahead. He has done some things that are funny, but mostly it's just swearing and being racist, with the occasional flash of semi-brilliance, I guess, here and there. Right, that's all the stories I really have for you today. Let's have a look at the chat. Sonic's the only one talking. The rest of you should speak up. Oh, you've stopped smoking. Well done, mate. Everything? Do you vape? How did you stop? Just flat cold turkey? I'm worried about the vape stories because so many people I know have used vaping to get off smoking cigarettes, and while it's not perfect or anything, you know, it's a big solution. And all this fuss aimed at vaping, I think isn't going to help people. But yeah. But you're glad that people are able to take cannabis-derived medication. Well, that's good. So am I. While I wait for any other comments, YouTube. Yes, this is the last bit of housekeeping, I guess. YouTube's changing a whole bunch of things, and if you don't have a commercially viable channel, you can be terminated. Apparently, this is in the changes of the terms of service. It's probably not as bad as people are saying, but it's so vaguely worded that it could be bad and a problem in the future. And it's not particularly encouraging, given they refuse to meet Jörg Sprav and the YouTubers Union, who are now being represented by IG Metall, which is a huge union in Germany that has taken on, you know, part-time workers, gig economy workers, things like that to represent their rights. They were all set to meet a few weeks back, 2, 3, maybe a month back, but they refused to meet IG Metall unless Jörg Sprav didn't come, and so IG Metall said, which means that now we have one of the largest, most powerful unions in Europe looking at taking legal action on behalf of creators on YouTube, which could be bad, could be good. It could be another nudge and shove that could mean the death knell of YouTube. I've been being dicked around, and I went back through the statistics, and this started at the beginning of October, somewhere around the 10th of October. I was getting 200 to 300 views regularly on a video, which is about what you expect, right? You expect to get a fraction of your subscribers, roughly a hundredth, I think. No, roughly a tenth of your subscribers viewing your videos. That's the kind of rule of thumb. So I was me getting 200 to 300 views per video was about right. And suddenly, beginning of October, it halved, and then halved again. And while it's been increasing again, it's become hard to get more than 100 views. Now, I didn't really make any videos last week to speak of, and my subscriber count went up by about 20, and then the moment I did upload a video, it went down by about half that. So that's going on again. The thing is, right, while I swear occasionally, I don't think I do anything that's really problematic or should really be problematic for advertisers. And what's the point of YouTube if it's more restrictive and more hostile to creators than cable television or anything like that? What's the point of it if it's more restrictive? And yeah, we have the technology to properly age rate and age appropriate segregate content, which would mean you could have child-friendly content in the right section and more adult content in the other section. Then advertisers could choose, but they're not implementing that. They're going for the lowest common denominator, so it would seem. So I have no idea whether my channel is commercially viable or not, whether this is a peculiarity of the season. I know things tend to slow down in a lot of creative industries before Christmas, and then they explode and the advertising revenue goes up and all the rest of it. Now, for me, YouTube has never been about making money or necessarily building a huge audience or anything. It's therapy for me to talk to people. because I spend so much time working alone, right? And I have felt itchy this week from not making videos. But I'd be lying if I said it wasn't disheartening to not see the investment of time and the amount of effort I've put into learning video editing techniques and software and audio editing techniques and software, to see that constantly being punished. Every time I feel like I'm making some ground, YouTube changes something and pulls the rug out from under me. So the Alan Moore video that I did, I experimented with different camera angles. More recently, I've been experimenting with better sound design and so on. This all takes more time that I don't really have, and I'm not getting the money from YouTube to justify it. And this is all stuff that, according to the experts, is supposed to help your visibility. Right? If you use more complicated and more professional cut techniques, if you use multiple camera angles, if you put more effort into the sound design, the algorithm is supposed to pick that up and promote your material. And yet that video, which is longer material, which they're supposed to be promoting, about someone who is in the news because of the new Watchmen series and all the rest of it, I really put a lot of effort into the production there, both sound and video. Made no difference. Still struggled to reach 100 views. So it's the usual problem. There is no communication from YouTube. And while I think these terms of service changes aren't as drastic as people are worrying, it's just deliberately vague, and there is no communication from them on how any of this works or is supposed to work. Whenever I log in to upload a video, whatever, right, go to the dashboard, and they've got news and blogs and so on, but it's all vapid and empty and not relevant to anything anyone's worrying about. But there aren't really any alternative platforms. There's BitChute, I guess, but that's really slow and unwieldy and really doesn't have a lot of use for a lot of people other than a backup for YouTube. I'm on YouTube because I do want to reach people. I do want to have an audience. That's just a bonus on top of why I do this, why I do the streams and everything. But there you go. Yeah. I'm not doing much today, just kind of tidying up the house and whatever. So I kind of don't want to go yet. But no one seems to have any questions or anything. Let's have a quick look on my Ask FM, see if anyone's got anything worthwhile there to ask me. While I'm here, because I'm unlikely to be doing much in the way of other videos this week. Bullshit, self-promotion. Clearly not addressed to me because it's a shout out. Blah, 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 blah. Blah, 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 blah. Clearly not for me. Phishing for personal information. What? Why do I bother? No, nothing there. Okay. So what's on this week? Finishing up work on the election party card game is the main thing. Catching up on some other work that's lagging behind. Commissioning a bit of art. Mostly I'm going to be kind of taking it easy because I've got so much else to do, looking after my mum, looking after the cat still. Mum's getting better, had a physio appointment. Moving around better, painkillers are working better to manage it all, so hopefully she's on the mend. Cat doing well. His legs a bit stiff, like we were expecting. That's probably permanent now, but it does seem to have healed. He's sitting up properly, like an Egyptian statue, and seems even more himself. So hoping to take him in for an X-ray soon. Without a checkup, he's probably still going to be in the crate for another 2 weeks, but I'll keep you posted. I stopped posting videos of him because all he really does is sit there in the cage. And also he keeps doing dirty protests, which I guess you would if you were in a prison cell. So it's not necessarily a pleasant sight, but that's wearing, cleaning up after him all the time. Anyway, I shall see you all later. I might do another video this week. There's all kinds of election stuff that I kind of want to cover, but we'll see. But don't expect too much for the rest of the month, and probably not too much through December either, given the holidays and given it's my birthday at the beginning of the month. And I really try to do basically fuck all around my birthday. See you later. Have a great rest of the day. Talk soon. Zang.